We have close to 200 registrants on our Zoom room. Some house rules does apply to this discussion. Chatham House rules does not apply because we are streaming live, so you might be either quoted or misquoted without your express permission. Also note that we will be launching an evaluation poll towards the end of the session. So to those in our online Zoom room, we do ask you to kindly fill that in. And to those in the room, you're also welcome to fill it in. It's been provided on your seats. So my name is Alice Leroux. I am part of the African Futures and Innovation Program here at the Institute for Security Studies, and I'll be your moderator for today's conversation. So the formation of South Africa's Government of National Unity represents a significant moment in our country's history. This coalition government arrived much sooner than many experts anticipated, bringing with it both opportunity and challenges. It offers South Africa a pivotal chance to implement much needed structural reforms to drive inclusive economic growth and enhance governance. The potential benefits of this government is promising. Job creation, poverty reduction, tackling inequality, and it has indeed rekindled hope for many in our country. Today's event marks the launch of South Africa's Long-Term Development Prospects 2043 report. The study launched today provides a sobering assessment of where the country is headed under a business-as-usual scenario. It also outlines 8 sectoral scenarios and identifies critical reforms in each one of these scenarios and sectors, giving us an optimistic forecast of what South Africa's future could potentially look like. The report quantifies what is possible if the coalition government can indeed unite behind pro-growth strategies and effectively deliver on the urgent growth reforms needed in our country. Drawing on extensive data modeling, the report demonstrates the tangible benefits of coordinated implementation, policy implementation, and not just the formulation thereof. So joining me on stage is 2 of our panelists. The third one I'll introduce, but you'll see him a little bit later. So first off, Dr. Yaki Silvier. He is the founder and the former executive director of the Institute for Security Studies. He currently serves as the chair of the ISS Board of Trustees, and he heads the African Futures and Innovation Program. Yaki has extensively researched Africa's long-term development prospects. One of his most recent books, Africa Tomorrow, Pathways to Prosperity, offers a very comprehensive view of the continent's future. And his earlier work, Fate of a Nation, explored South Africa's political, economic, and social trajectory. Today, Yaki will be taking us through the key findings of this study in a much-needed interactive presentation using the African Futures and Innovation portal. Kolewa Kashe Katia is a dynamic leader with extensive experience in strategic scenario development and long-term planning. She is the former managing director of Maropeng Africa, where she oversaw efforts to bring South Africa's rich history to life. She also served as a director at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflections, MISTRA, contributing to high-level research on South Africa's socio-political landscape. Currently, she leads the Indulamiti South Africa Scenario Project, a flagship initiative that explores possible futures for the country through rigorous scenario planning. Her expertise in big picture thinking and her ability to navigate complex social, economic, and political dynamics will offer valuable insights today as she reflects on the findings that we'll be presenting today. Desigan Naidu is a scientist, indeed a leader, and an activist for positive social change. He currently heads the Climate Adaptation Unit at the South Africa President Climate Commission, and is also the head of the African Climate Risk and Human Security Program here at the Institute for Security Studies. He serves as president of Human Right to Water and is a founding member of the Water Policy Group. Desigan sits on multiple water advisory boards, and his extensive experience in climate adaptation, water governance will bring a critical lens to today's discussion, given that climate resilience and resource security are fundamental to the country's long-term growth and stability. So thank you to all 3 of you joining us today. And without further ado, Yaki, I'm going to ask you to come to the stage and to give us an overview of the key findings.
Thanks, Alice. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much, Elise, for that great introduction. So I've taken you to the front page of the website that we host at the African Futures and Innovation program at the Institute. It's a very large website. It was launched by President Ramaphosa in June of 2022. I'm going to present from the website. I want to start off by saying that if you want, I'm going to say a few words about the forecasting platform and the methodology. For more information on this, go to the About section on the website. There's a tremendous amount of information. I will say something additionally about that on the forecasting methodology, the forecasting platform, the data that we've used, and how we model. In the thematic section of the website, you can find different themes, how Africa is going to evolve on energy, on demographics, on climate, and so on, how global developments impact on the continent. I'm going to speak to you on one of the geographies that we have forecast, in this case, South Africa. So I've opened up the menu, you can scroll down, and we've done forecasts for each African country, for each regional economic community, country income groups, and so on. Each one of these is quite extensive. So the South African forecast is a page on the website. If you scroll down on that page, on the left-hand side, a content menu will appear. And the content menu provides you with a menu, an index of what is on the website. It's freely available. Everything I'm going to present to you is available on the website, plus much more. There is also a link where you can click on the charts and so on. So I'm going to use this, what we refer to as a slider, to take you through some of the essential characteristics, elements of South Africa's long-term future. This is a depiction of the international futures forecasting model that we use. As I indicated, more information is available in the About section. IFS is a model of models. It is hosted and developed at the Pardee Center at the University of Denver, and we use this model. It's consistently being updated. It is free and open source, including the relationships that drive the parameters when we intervene. So you can drill down and see where the data comes from and so on. It is a model of models. So what I'm showing you, without discussing it, are the largest submodules that constitute the model as a whole, which is highly integrated and interactive and quite complex. It is without a doubt the single most comprehensive forecasting platform that is freely available. This is what we do, typically for every geography in Africa. We look at the current path forecast, that's the bottom arrow. And then we typically model, so that's where the country or the geography goes, given current circumstances, history, the context. And once we've done that, we have, for what I'm going to present to you, we model 8 sectors. We model the impact of demographics and health, agriculture, education, manufacturing, infrastructure and leapfrogging, free trade, financial flows, and governance. There are 8 sectors. What we do in each of these 8 sectors is we benchmark what would be possible for South Africa, given its level of GDP per capita, education, and so on, in a single positive scenario. And then we combine this to look at what is South Africa's potential. In a sense, what we model is where South Africa is headed on its current path, and then what is its development potential if all good things come together. Of course, it is unlikely that that will happen. We don't have a crystal ball. We cannot predict. We can do scenarios and where we look at what is potentially possible. But those 8 sectors I'm going to present to you very briefly. Now, we do this for every African country, for every regional economic community, and every income group in Africa. That's why there are more than 4,000 charts on this website. It's a lot of data. Data has a constraining effect on you when you do forecasting. There are many of us that, and I also that did sort of blue skies thinking. This is where we would like to be. But once you start using data, it sort of cramps your style. So we do this for every geography. And then once we have done that, that's in the middle of the diagram, then we also look on the website on the impact of climate change, energy, employment and jobs, gender, and how global developments impact on Africa. Each of these themes are in the thematic section on the website and are quite extensive and quite comprehensive. We've done global scenarios on Africa's energy transition and so on and so forth. I'm not going to discuss more about the methodology or the approach, but that middle segment, those 8 current path and the 8 sectoral scenarios, giving you a combined impact is what we did for South Africa. So South Africa's population is projected to grow from about 61 million people to about 74.4 million people by 2043. We have not brought in the latest Stats SA census. As you know, there's a bit of controversy around that, and we weren't completely convinced that the data is reliable. So this shift will place significant pressure on urban infrastructure and services, necessitating substantial investments to accommodate the growth in a safe and a sustainable manner. We always start with population, it's sort of the basics. It's also the easiest thing to forecast. South Africa's GDP, the total size of the economy, is expected to increase from about 392 billion. Everything that I'm showing you is in 2017 constant US dollars, so not in rand, to about 634 billion by 2043. So that's a 62% increase from 2023. That is huge. However, this growth is quite modest compared to other upper middle income countries. There are, I think, 56 upper middle income countries globally. And since South Africa is one of 8 upper middle income countries in Africa, we compare South Africa with those 56 or 58 global upper middle income countries. And I think our current path analysis is really a concerning trend. And it underpins the need for structural reforms to address persistent challenges such as inequality, unemployment, and deindustrialization. So that is a history and forecast of the size of the South African economy. On the left is 2017 US dollars, and at the bottom is the time period from 1990 onwards with data until about 2022, and then a forecast until 2043. That is the 2007-2008 financial crisis and its impact globally and on South Africa. That is the impact of COVID-19 on the South African economy. So this looks like quite an optimistic forecast. And as I've said, this is then our current path of where we think South Africa, the size of the South African economy. However, GDP per capita, the total size of the economy divided by the population, peaked in 2013, and South Africa will only recover to that level in 2036. That is a sobering statement. That is 23 years that it will take us to get back to where we were in 2013. The country is growing more slowly than most other upper middle income countries. In the end of apartheid in 1990, South Africa's GDP per capita was about $4,200 above the average for upper middle income countries. By 2023, it was about $4,900 below. And in the current path forecast, it will be about $12,000 below by 2043. Now, why do we use 2043? Everything we do, as you saw on the front page of our website, is done in support and in collaboration with ODA-NEPAD. And ODA-NEPAD, which is the development agency of the Africa Union, is the custodian of Africa's development plan, Agenda 2063. Agenda 2063 was launched in 2013. It looks backwards 50 years till the establishment of the OAU in 1963, and it looks forward 50 years to 2063. And it is implemented in 10-year implementation plans. Since 2063 is fine when you're doing forecasts on climate change and so on, it's very distant when you're doing this kind of work. So our forecast horizon is 2043, which is the end of the third 10-year implementation plan of Agenda 2063. 2013, 23, 33, 43, 53, 63. This is that same story now in graphical form. At the bottom, time period from 1990 until 2043, the blue line is South Africa, GDP per capita. The orange line is GDP per capita for the average for upper middle income countries globally. It shows the extent to which, on this very brute measure, South Africa is slowly and surely falling behind. We know this. This is no. We know about the fact about how slowly South Africa has been growing in recent years. On the current path, poverty rates are anticipated to decline only modestly. So if we use the World Bank measure of $6.85, which is the monetary poverty level that we use for upper middle income countries, about 57, more than half of South Africa's population lived in extreme poverty. And it comes down very slowly. And it comes down very slowly because of our high levels of inequality, a very small informal sector, which can absorb inequality and unemployment. And these factors mean that growth does not in South Africa translate into poverty reduction, despite the fact that more than 26 million South Africans are on social grants. Had it not been for social grants, it would have been a much worse situation. So that's a depiction on the left-hand side of the percent of population, on the right-hand side of the number of South Africans living in extreme poverty. On the left-hand side, the ratio, the percent of people living in extreme poverty comes down marginally. But on the right-hand side, we see that the number of South Africans living in extreme poverty actually increase on the current path, because of course the South African population is growing. South Africa's poor human capital endowment is the most significant drag on multi-factor productivity growth. Growth comes from the contribution that labor, capital, and multi-factor productivity or technology make. And when you look at technology, our contribution that is made within the South African economy to multi-factor productivity in South Africa is very low, because we have very severe and acute malnutrition, high levels of inequality, poor health, high disease burden. Largely because of HIV/AIDS, the life expectancy in South Africa is 11 years below the average for upper middle income countries globally. Only Botswana and Namibia have comparable high levels of HIV/AIDS. And this has been a huge drag on South Africa's development. The Government of National Unity can play a critical role by ensuring policy coherence, accountability, and effective implementation. Amongst the 8 scenarios that we model, our better governance scenario has the largest positive impact on poverty reduction, and is second only to free trade in improving GDP per capita by 2043. Again, this is not a surprise. Poor governance has been a characteristic of South Africa, particularly since Jacob Zuma became president. In the combined scenario, where we combine these 8 scenarios with one another, it provides a substantial potential uplift in South Africa's economic and social outcomes. The scenario forecasts almost a 32% increase in GDP per capita above the current path forecast by 2043. Now remember that even our current path forecast is an improvement in GDP per capita. So a 32% increase on that is quite aggressive, indicating that coordinated and comprehensive policy actions can significantly alter South Africa's development trajectory. So that would be the size of the South African economy on the current path, the blue line at the bottom, versus the combined scenario, the combination of the 8 scenarios in the top orange line. So our forecast is that South Africa would grow at a rate of about 2.4% out till 2043 in the current path. But on the combined scenario, we'd get to about 4.6% GDP growth. So the National Development Plan that was finalized in 2012 set a growth target of 5.4%, average growth rate for South Africa. We've never come close to that. And this is the problem exactly when you use data and you use modeling to look at the long term. Where you want to go and where you could go are very different. The free trade scenario, where we model the full implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, delivers the largest increase in GDP per capita, followed by better governance. In the combined scenario, GDP per capita would be about 32% above the current path, equivalent to almost $5,000 per person increase. These are the contributions of in GDP per capita for each of the 8 scenarios. So that's what I meant, that the Continental Free Trade Area scenario has the largest reduction in extreme poverty, followed by governance, manufacturing, agriculture, financial flows, education, demographics and health, large infrastructure, and leapfrogging. So what we did in the first scenario, the Continental Free Trade Area scenario, as I've indicated, we modeled the impact of the Continental Free Trade Area on growth. And we benchmarked that with, for example, what the World Bank had done. On governance, we look at 3 dimensions of governance. We model each. We look at security, capacity, and inclusion, and their combined contribution to growth. In manufacturing, we look at the improvements in productivity in the South African economy, and we model how that could contribute to an economy that, according to some, for example, Professor Black at the University of Cape Town, has significant potential to increase employment, reduce unemployment. Agriculture was one of the surprises for us, that the contribution that the agricultural sector can make to South Africa's growth to GDP per capita is significant. The Western Cape is the area that has the largest that is South Africa's agricultural heartland, but along the East Coast, particularly the former homelands, KwaZulu-Natal, former Ciskei, Transkei, these are areas that are under traditional, where land is communally owned, that if we can unlock that potential, it can make a huge difference to South Africa's agricultural contribution. Financial flows consist of more foreign direct investment, remittances, less illicit financial outflows, and of course, foreign direct investment. Of these, foreign direct investment is by far the most important. And we were very aggressive in pushing foreign direct investment up, but it has less impact than what we actually thought. Education and health only change over the long term. That's why they have such a limited impact. Think of it. A child has to go through all the grades at school and possibly tertiary education before he or she contributes, in actual fact, to the economy. I think the poor contribution of large infrastructure and leapfrogging is maybe the other surprise. South Africa, by comparative standards, has good infrastructure, but we suspect why this has limited impact is because much of that infrastructure is in disrepair, and so much of the effort is in repairing the existing infrastructure. Because inequality is stubborn, poverty reduction per scenario is modest, even in the combined scenario. Better governance has the most impact, followed by agriculture. In addition, so we would need to carry on with social grants, grow the informal sector, and we would have to carry on with employment schemes. These are the reductions in in monetary poverty, using $6.85 per person in South Africa in each of those 8 scenarios, plus the current path and the combined scenario. So the line on the right-hand side that goes is obviously the most aggressive, shows that in the combined scenario, extreme poverty can possibly get to about 50% instead of the 64% that it is at the moment. That is still very, very low. That is really a concerning forecast. Carbon emissions, South Africa released almost 500 million tons of CO2 from fossil fuels in 2023. which we can reduce to 366 million tons as it transitions away from coal. Let me show you what this looks like. Firstly, South Africa needs an energy production future based on renewables, nuclear and gas. Now, I'll say something around that. Let me show you this. So this is our current energy production in South Africa. Most of it is coal. This is 2023. Nuclear is 2.1%. There's a sliver of renewables and a sliver of gas. This is 2023. By 2043, on the left-hand side is the current path. On the right-hand side is the combined scenario. So in the current path, we think that South Africa will, by 2043, still be dependent on coal for 66% of its energy production. You can't get away from coal. If you look at the right-hand side, after we throw everything at our energy sector, coal can reduce to about 44%. But it is still a significant burden on South Africa. Other renewables, we can increase from 32 to 44%. Nuclear, we modeled the additional 2,400 megawatts that is already announced in the Integrated Resource Plan for 2021. So nuclear expands to about 2.8%. But the future for South Africa is renewables, gas, and nuclear. There's no way of getting away from this, unless you expect South Africa somehow to develop without energy. So, to conclude, a series of recommendations. The report is quite long on the website. We have so many plans in South Africa, and strategies, and compacts. What we don't have is implementation. And we don't have a consequence management to fix, stabilize, and professionalize municipal, provincial, and national government. We need a more flexible labor market in South Africa. Very contentious, difficult, but if you want to deal with unemployment, you have to do something to relax the very rigid labor market that we have in South Africa. This is often considered some kind of ideological issue. It is not. It is just simple, basic economics. We need to pursue an export-led growth strategy. That seems to be happening with the Government of National Unity. We don't have an export-led growth strategy. We hide behind protective barriers and inward industrialization. We try and keep foreigners out of the economy, make it as difficult as possible for foreign companies to invest. We need to invest in education, particularly, and in health. We have lost almost 2-3 decades in the lack of real reform on the educational system, and the indices of the ability to read for meaning speak for themselves. We need to unlock investment in the mining sector, tourism, and light manufacturing. Our natural market is in Africa. It's the only area, Southern Africa, where we can compete against China. But what has happened is Chinese industrialization and the growth of China into the manufacturing hub of the world has decimated, amongst others, the South African manufacturing sector. We need to reestablish our ability to compete in Southern Africa. Land reform in the former homelands with appropriate infrastructure and financial support can unlock a revolution in agricultural production. Politically very, very difficult. We need to facilitate the growth of the informal sector. By comparative standards, South Africa has a very small informal sector. And growing the informal sector is a way to absorb people into some type of productive activity, reduce inequality. We need to climate-proof all new investments, and we need to invest in renewables, gas, and nuclear. Can't get away from it, much as we would like. We need to make the country safe. And as the Institute for Security Studies, we have done a mountain of research on this area. What is lacking is leadership and reform of the criminal justice system, and of course the political support. And at the moment what we see in the country is of course a deliberate fight back campaign by the state capture units, politically and otherwise, to try and halt reform. Because of course this is a question of, are we going to go into orange overalls or not? We need to ensure the rule of law. And then, if you want to grow a country, you need to find a way of building social inclusion. Hugely difficult for South Africa, given our history, our legacy. We will at some point need to find a way to move towards a class-based analysis instead of a race-based analysis. The results are the same. The majority of poor South Africans are black, and we need to do everything possible to change the racial structure of our economy. But you can't do that based on race-based policies. So, Alice, thanks very much. That's the summary of the recommendations and done in partnership with Ordo NAPLAT, the Hans Seidel Foundation, and Sweden. Thanks very much.
I'm going to ask you to join me on stage. So I think what we've seen from Jackie is quite a comprehensive overview, but a very data-driven overview as well. Kulewa, I'm going to turn to you first, and specifically given your strategic perspective and the work you've done in the Indlamiti scenarios, can you reflect on what you've seen Jackie present?
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks, Jackie and the ISS for such an informative report, but also the opportunity for Indlamiti to also participate in the validation of the report and now to comment on it. And as indicated, I mean, there are lots of synergies between the two parcels of work because we're both working with future studies, although the ISS is more data focused and also global in its nature because the data is drawn from a global platform. But also the sectors. And I think for us, that's something that we found very interesting and potentially useful for even our work going forward, because it gives a granular detail of specific sectors. Because with Indlamiti, as much as we looked at the global landscape, it was more in terms of global phenomena such as health issues like the pandemics, technology, and so on. But I must say that I think there's value in terms of using sector-specific categorization strategies when building scenarios. I mean, what you released is actually quite ambitious, I must say, even looking at just the current pathway. I mean, you do say that you believe that these aspirations are quite achievable. And with us, I think the difference now comes in terms of not only just the horizon, because ours is more South Africa based, and the horizon is much shorter. We're looking at 2035, whereas you're aligning to the African agenda, the AU's agenda, but with the horizon of 2043. And also the sectors for our scenarios were interwoven. Ours are not as aspirational, I must say. And oftentimes when we present the Indlamiti scenarios that we launched, the 2035 scenarios, a lot of people start saying we are prophets of doom because we have a very troubling vulture culture scenario, which is a nation that's actually vulturizing or cannibalizing itself with both internal and external vultures coming in to take what they believe is theirs through criminal ways, or there's criminal syndicates that become endemic, and we've already started seeing indications towards that. We also have the Hadida nation, or Hadida home rather, which is a very noisy, bickering nation. When it comes to, I mean, you've mentioned ideological tensions that we have, which are legacy issues as a country, and they seem to continue into the present, where you see in the political space there's a lot of that bickering. I mean, we've seen our parliament, how loud it is, but also society at large. You go to even social media platforms, is a fight every day. So there is that scenario. Even the most popular scenario, the Weaver work, which the president seems to like, and I've seen many other analysts referencing this Weaver work scenario because it's the most positive Indlamiti scenario. But even that, before it gets to that cooperative coalition government, that the precursor to that is an implosion, actually, a very popular uprising from below by the people. So, I mean, I suppose with us, all three scenarios have those elements that are quite frightening, but with the Weaver work, with a positive outcome after the so-called revolution. And I think really, when I look closely at the current path also, I mean, when we landed with the last scenarios, we were at the worst case scenario, that was driven by inequality, where it was a state of lawlessness, and that was even amplified further by COVID. And that's why we had to refresh the scenarios to get to these ones. So already we were coming from the worst case scenario. So it was difficult for us, like when we were reading the report, when you look at things like the economy, some improvements in terms of the GDP, you think, how is that possible with, because at the same time, we're thinking about these two ugly scenarios that we have, which is that of a bickering coalition government, by the way, one that is vulturizing itself. So then I think that's where it would differ. But in terms of population, the demographics, I think the numbers are similar. With us, we land at 70 million at 2035 and you at 73.4. In terms of, there's acknowledgement that poverty is still going to remain with us. And in terms of agriculture, which is interesting, it's the same kind of positive outlook in terms of the potential the agricultural sector has in all the scenarios, really. I think it's something, even when you look at all the reports around the post-COVID recovery, it seems like agriculture has that potential to take the country forward. And I mean, as I've said, with economic growth, our role in the African continental free trade area, I mean, we've got two scenarios where even other African countries start discrediting the political system in South Africa as a result of, all the problems that we see happening from 2024 election into 2029 election, then 2034. And so that's where we differ there. But also, I mean, I don't know how the government, even in the current pathway, how it can have an impact on poverty reduction, because the way we saw it is that it just gets worse. If it's the current pathway, then it will be worse. We're not sure which way it will be because we'll wait for the barometer. But my own personal thoughts would be maybe it would land us in the Hadida nation, which is a very noisy democracy, which doesn't really have any outputs, but to just argue and bicker on the basis of, political or ideological underpinnings. In terms of the combined scenarios, that is now the the 8 sectors. Once again, I mean, we struggle with this difference in terms of the GDP because we don't see improvement in the economy unless that rupture happens, and then we have the weaver work, and that can only start being felt, post 2034. So I suppose with us, it's really there was a lot of focus on the politics, which are shifting. I mean, the political landscape is shifting every day, even with the formation of the government of national unity. We've seen several shifts happening since the May 29th election. So that is one element where I think maybe creates this, difference between the two scenarios. But also, I mean, when it comes to the conclusions and way forward, the idea of collaboration, paying attention to ethical leadership, that's where we find each other again, because those are key ingredients if we were to even imagine the so-called social compact that we like to reference. I want to make a note on methodology, because I think for us, it's like the biggest difference in terms of the methodological approach. And I think one of our reference group members, when we validated, spoke to that about, as much as there's data and there's all the systems and models and so on, what we need to pay attention to is the human. The value of the social sciences, anthropology, in terms of the methodological approaches. I mean, we struggled when we started with the first scenarios, because we found that even when we went and engaged, because our methodology is intuitive logic approach, which entails engaging with experts. But when we recruited those experts, we found that it was usually men that were above 50. So we had to go back to the drawing board and pay specific attention to the South African demographics, pay attention to the fact that there's more young people there in the majority. We had to pay attention to race, we had to pay attention to gender, and so on. And it took a lot of rounds of finding strategies. We knew that we're not going to find them in rooms such as this one if we're looking at young people. We had to create some digital platforms, that sort of like mirror social media platforms where these debates can take place. And that's how we managed to extract, some of the most fascinating findings from the youthful group in the first round was the issue of human trafficking, which is something we're not even thinking about. We do not even understand it as well. But because they're the ones who are unemployed, they're the ones who are looking for jobs, and they're the most vulnerable to human trafficking, it came up and we had to take it seriously. So even with the second round, we had to pay attention to the humans to contribute. So we had lots of interviews, lots of workshops, lots of focus group discussions. And I think it could be an added layer, because then I think that's another influence in terms of the difference. I speak of this a rupture. And I think because one of our key driving forces is that of internal security that is threatened by anger and resentment and distrust that exists among South African citizens. And I think as the ISS, that's your area. But it came out for our scenarios as one of the key drivers amongst the three drivers towards the future of South Africa. And I think that's something that we need to look at because it's not well understood. But what we found is that it ranked very highly in terms of its potential impact on our future. And in that key driving force, we're looking at things like social dislocation of young people. We're looking at anger, again, and distrust, which manifests in violent crime, violent protests. We look at the historical trauma that is still not dealt with. We've had the TRCs, the RDPs of the soul, but the festering wound that South Africa has not really been effectively dealt with, and that anger is carried out, and you see it even in young people. And there's very little spaces for integration where South Africans can actually achieve or attain social cohesion, and really without meaningful inclusion of young people in all these different platforms, we still run the risk of creating this passivity amongst our citizens. But also there's the issue of migration, which keeps coming up and we keep silencing it. So there's a lot of speaking past each other when it comes to, immigration control. Land reform, you spoke about that as something that we need to actually pay attention to. We found that it also adds to that resentment where citizens are wrangling over even the constitution itself, because there's this feeling that land reform has not really been dealt with. But also, the party politics. I don't know what it is about South Africans. We still try, young people do politic outside the party political spaces, but we still find that there is that persistence of party political conflict and factionalism, and then it bleeds into the nation, it bleeds into what government is doing, and which is now there's that risk in terms of this government of national unity. We certainly saw it 2 years after the first government of national unity. And it's so interesting how now that's been, modeled against that, whereas that one only lasted 2 years and then it imploded. So, we do agree with you about collaboration, because for the most positive, after the implosion, we see that for us to take the nation forward, there has to be that collaboration, not just political parties. We have to have a strong civil society, which has legitimacy, and activist business sector, big business in particular. And just off the basis of the history, the benefits that big business, made, historically, and how then they can be compelled to also invest in taking the country forward, as opposed to waiting for government to sort itself out. So, all of those brought together, and we see the Weaver Nation actually being driven by young people who are activists, faith-based groups, artists, the creatives. So we see that positive scenario, the ideal scenario that takes us on that growth path being actually as a result of that moment of implosion and then rebuilding after that. Otherwise, it's difficult to see anything, us moving from this worst case scenario that we found ourselves in last year to a positive growth path. So I think I'll leave it there as just my response for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to get to this again, but I do want to ask you, Yaki, just to respond. I think the one narrative that comes through strongly is about strong governance. You call it better governance. And when you model, you talk about security and capacity, both of the elements that you mentioned needs to be addressed, and then the accountability as well. Could you just quickly, again, just reiterate the impact of a good governance scenario on South Africa's future?
Yeah, so we were quite surprised by when you take those three dimensions, security, capacity, and inclusion, the sum impact on it is in actual fact better, more government effectiveness, which is something that the World Bank and a variety of organizations model and follow and track. And that's really what you want to achieve, because what we've seen since, well, the last two decades is really a deterioration of government effectiveness and the ability to govern in South Africa. And we see that evident, and you refer to the nature of South African politics. And I think what we tend to underestimate is just the political infighting and contestation around issues, particularly around state capture, that is happening in South Africa. We see that play out almost on a daily basis in Parliament. And then you see the two largest parties that have created the Government of National Unity that come from such diverse backgrounds. And but maybe going off on a tangent there, I think that we were quite surprised by how the impact of course, of government effectiveness spans through everything within the economy. It improves the quality of your education, it improves your manufacturing potential, your trade, and everything. So it's the one thing that really is like a cross-cutting issue. And the closest, well, it's part of that, but the issue of rule of law, stability, of course, also speaks to that. But it really is, and that's, of course, there's been a lot of talk in South Africa on the capable state, the developmental state, but the state in many areas is dysfunctional. It's not working. There are some signs that there could be improvement, but at the moment, but it is really a long haul given the damage that has been done. And the problems are that many of the efforts that have been made to improve government effectiveness and capacity have in actual fact turned out to be problematic. And we can speak about some of them, but what has happened is that government in South Africa is done what the old National Party government has done by bringing people in. It's become an employment agency, but it doesn't in today's modern world add effectiveness on implementation. And modern technology can do so much to improve the way in which we govern. Just simply listen to the reforms that can happen, how SARS operates, or how we can improve home affairs. These are all ways in which we can improve government effectiveness. And I think our argument is not for a larger government, but it's certainly for a more effective government, for a more efficient government that uses modern technology and doesn't try and compensate for productivity and for government effectiveness by bringing more people in, because that's what we've done. It's a big issue, and then I think lots of room for improvement in that really is to the benefit of all South Africans.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll unpack that a little bit when we open up the floor for questions. But again, I'm going to turn to you. You sit in a unique position in the Presidential Climate Commission. So I want you to reflect on Jackie's presentation, but I also want you to make comments specifically on the forecasting regarding the energy transition mix. And I do see there's already coming quite a lot of questions coming through on our Zoom room about the role of nuclear, renewables, gas in South Africa's future. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. Let me be clear. I don't have a mandate from the presidency to talk on behalf of the presidency. So you'd have to accept my ISS hat today. But first, just to preface the comments around the energy mix with a few others. Firstly, having the availability of a data-rich platform to engage is a really big deal. It seriously is. And it takes away a lot of the speculation. It starts to test some of the assumptions, and this is crucially important around our planning and how to move forward. The second is something that I know Jackie knows about it, but he didn't emphasize it in this presentation, is that we're sitting in a very interesting global environment in the world today. The world today is not what it was a decade ago, and the future certainly isn't what it was a decade ago. And it isn't just about the 50 elections that are happening around the world this year, 49 planned and one added, because what we're seeing already from those elections is a mega shift in the global policy environment. I mean, there is the shift to the right. There is the massive shift to a national security first paradigm by very powerful players in the world. There are direct attacks on multilateral systems by those who hold up the flag of democracy in the world. This is one of the ironies of the system that we live in. And to contrast, on the African continent perhaps for the first time after a long time wants to give a very meaningful input into developing an African platform around our own future. So there's an issue of timing. Maybe if Africa did this 30 years ago, we might have had a better result because we have a lot more to wade through in the current global environment. The second is around the standing of the political class in the world. The point you made about the youth and the youth disinvestment in the South African environment, in the formal structures, is a global phenomenon. It's a difficult phenomenon for people as old as I, because we don't really understand it. But the youth are quite confident about the way they're engaging with the shaping of the world. And they have very interesting places to point to as results. One of those is climate change. The youth expression around climate change outside the formalized structures is enormously effective. The youth mobilization around the war in Gaza has demonstrated how global opinions can shift outside formal institutions. So us playing a catch-up, if you like, Yaki, on what governance needs to be is something that I think we need to ponder on. But let's talk to the energy mix. Now, the one thing about South Africa's climate position is that in this government of national unity, one party has been very pronounced on its position, and none of the other parties have opposed it. So this is a plus. And in general, all of the parties in that coalition, either explicitly or by an absence of protest, have invested in this idea that South Africa's trajectory is to a renewable energy dominated economy into the future. The thing that is in big discussion is pace and scale. And this is a discussion for South Africa. It is a discussion that's happening everywhere in the world. And I would like to venture that our noisy democracy, and you are right, we are, our noisy democracy is far more succinct around its expression and its trajectory than many players where we didn't expect this. I mean, our European colleagues and their massive turnarounds associated with the Ukraine war in particular and the energy security of Europe, in spite of the reassurances that it's a blip, a small turnaround to get back on the pathway, given the big shifts to the right wing in both the European Parliament elections, as well as elections in various countries, including Germany coming up next year, is indicating that it might not stick in the same way that it had before. So we have that as a plus. The second thing that we have to engage around this issue around pace and scale is that this notion of this being an exclusively nationally controlled decision is a fantasy. We operate in global chains around these matters. So even the most ambitious high carbon person in the South African environment, in as much as they like to hang on to the coal industry, this is simply not practical. You're going to be completely isolated from the world, not only on the basis of trade, because the CBAMs are very real. And the CBAMs has many expressions in different parts of the world. There are carbon barriers now. There have been carbon barriers for at least 20 years. They're just going to get much, much more intense going into the future. You also need to look at the positioning of the high carbon players in the current global environment and what they're doing. I mean, when China says it's 2070 for their net zero, it probably is 2060. And they're peaking in 2035. And India is exactly the same trajectory. The entire global industrial structure is going to be based primarily on renewable energy systems. South Africa has to wake up to that reality. This is not an independent decision in your backyard. It is part of a very global decision. So there are two instruments now that are being debated intensely. One is the IRP. And this is the energy mix plan. And we're talking about an IRP 2024. I think it might be an IRP 2025, a bit late in 2024, around getting that mix right. And that mix is about two things. It is about what the endpoint is, but it is about the transition. That's going to be the expression. It's not just saying this is what we need to do in 5 years. It's going to be saying this is what we need to do in 5 years in order to be at net zero in 2050. And that's an important expression. The second expression is the NDC, the nationally determined contribution. Now, the world was taken with the ambition that South Africa expressed in Glasgow. We took a very ambitious plan. You talked about some of the data associated with that plan. On the back of that, I would argue that it captured the interest of partners in a very positive way. This thing called the JET partnership, this 8.5 billion, which is closer to 11 now, because other partners have joined, drew the interest on the basis of a high carbon developing country making a very ambitious push to be in another space. And we are getting that dividend. Arguably, others are also getting the dividend because there are JETPs now in many other parts of the world. But this movement, I think, is irreversible. So the debate right now is around what is South Africa going to register next year in the UNFCCC around the new NDC. Are we going to maintain the ranges that we talked about? Are we going to get more ambitious about those ranges? Or are we going to fall back on the back of what has become a very powerful voice to maintain a slower movement to decarbonization? What does it mean for the specific technologies? Well, the chart that Yaki put up around the renewable energy part of the mix is almost already a reality. As we sit here today, there are 6 gigawatts, 6,000 megawatts of renewable energy in build. It's happening. It's going to be there. That number can double very easily in the next decade. It can triple, actually, because the cost of the technologies is another factor that's come into the mix. Our ability to put those things onto a more reasonable grid space with things like microgrids and mini-grids, it's all starting to happen very rapidly. The bigger questions around this is what is the long-term future for the carbon-based, the high carbon-based energy installation generators in our system? Well, there are only 2 big generators that are still going to be inside their design life when we hit the 2050 net zero target, and that's Medupi and Kusile. None of the other power stations will have their design life extended to that point. They might be stretched a little, but it's not going to reach there. And there is no plan in the current IRP to build more coal-fired power stations. So that story is kind of over. The story you have to concentrate on is, with the rest of the options, what is going to be the nature of space? And nuclear is the one that's drawing a lot of debate, as it should, because nuclear is not an easy decision. There are 3 basic issues around the nuclear debate that I think we have to absorb. The first, it's not a thing that you can do at small scale. You either have to do this big or go home, because there's a whole value chain associated with it where the economies of scale really matters. This is not only true of the large installations, this is also true of the SMRs, the small modular reactors. So if you're going to do nuclear power stations, you're talking about 4 or 5, not 1. If you're talking about SMRs, it's not 1 or 2 modules, it's 20 or 30. And that's the scale that you have to operate. The second issue around it is that, yes, it is true that you have to pay a lot of attention to the issues around safety and the environmental concerns. And there are many, many places to learn from. We're not having this debate off the bat, but we have to be talking about the right generation of technology. So we can't be talking about Gen 1s like Fukushima, because that's not on the landscape. We need to be talking about Gens 4 and 5 and beyond. And this is also true for the small modular reactions. The third is that in the nuclear arena, upfront capitalization is not small. This is a very big investment. You've got to put out the big chunks of funds right up front in order to get the installation to be there. Renewable energy gives you safety from all of this. You can be incremental, you can be smaller scale and build up on it, because all of renewable energy is modular. It does have certain difficulties around when you have solar and wind available and when you don't, but there are loads of backup options. And the optimization of control is something that's gone to a different degree of the system. And then there is the big gas question for South Africa. And gas is for South Africa, this is a really big issue. One is that we're punting on this as the transition fuel. Gas takes us from the coal base into the renewable energy base. But gas reliability is a challenge. And there are three issues associated with that. One is the primary import point we were looking at, which is Cabo Delgado, has a few challenges associated with it that we know about. And securing that is something that we have to work a lot harder on. There have been pronouncements made by the Mozambican government. There have been pronouncements made by the new presidential candidates that will take over in Mozambique, and they sound positive, but there are some real issues to be dealt with around Cabo Delgado. That's one. Two is the issue around our infrastructure. So if you're taking gas from far away to where you need it, you need a gas pipeline infrastructure. And one of the lessons that we have from a country like the Netherlands, for example, is that when you do the switch, you can be sitting with a stranded asset that you can do pretty much nothing else with. Now, some investigations are being made about repurposing for hydrogen, for example. The numbers are not easy. They're very, very, very difficult numbers. And the third issue, which we thought we would not have to think about, is the safety of the infrastructure, of gas infrastructure. And the incident in Johannesburg has made us all think really long and hard about what that reality is. And that's a really big part of it. But there's another part of that in the infrastructure that is really important, because the primary carbon link for gas is around efficiency of conveyance. So gas escaping as methane really damages your greenhouse gas emissions very, very rapidly. So the integrity of your infrastructure is absolutely key. So on the energy front, there's a lot to examine. And there are very big decisions to be made, and they have to be made in the very short term, but they have to be made. Let me pause there.
Yeah, thank you. And I think a lot of the questions that was posed online as well around the role of nuclear and gas, Desikan has now answered. So Yaki, I want to give you just 2 minutes to respond to that, but I want you to focus on the work that the Institute has done with regards to Africa's energy transition, but to keep in mind that this is a South Africa discussion, so just bring it back to South Africa. Yeah. But just because of this specific point around gas being a transition fuel and the role of SMNR technologies in South Africa's future, I want you to briefly touch on that in the context of Africa.
Thanks, Elise. And I should just mention, you didn't mention that Elise is a co-author on the South Africa study, and we jointly worked on a big study that we did on Africa's energy and climate transition. I'll just summarize the short version of that. So when you look at, so Africa suffers from huge energy poverty, and it has a very large and growing population. So energy demand from Africa and Africa's associated carbon emissions are going to go through the roof. And we modeled what is possible for Africa to get rid of coal, to get rid of oil, to reduce oil and gas. And we looked at the United Nations Environmental Program, their 2023 production report. It was UN Environmental Program 2023 production report, to see what is possible. And the short version of that is that on current technology, Africa can't get away from gas, because gas is your transition fuel. So we can reduce oil, we can maybe eliminate coal. Coal is South Africa, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Mozambique. It doesn't really affect other countries. But there's no other technology that can replace your fossil fuel gap, your energy gap. So you can do the fleet of SMRs and build nuclear, and you can ramp up renewables as rapidly as you want to. But unless there is a huge technology breakthrough, on storage and so on other things, you really face a problem. So who's going to fund the stranded assets on gas investment in Africa? And what is that future? And is the international community prepared to fund gas exploration? And will Africa use the gas for domestic use? Because at the moment, Africa is a net energy exporter. It's mostly gas and oil that we export and coal that we export. And of course, what needs to happen is we increasingly will have to use that for our own energy needs and stop exporting gas, coal, and oil. And then our carbon, so if we go down this route where we reduce oil and eliminate coal, but our gas production carries on and we use that domestically in Africa, there's the stranded acid issue, but also there's the carbon emissions issue, because our forecasts are that Africa's carbon emissions overtake by the second half of the century are the largest globally, more than China, more than India, more than anybody else, for a variety of reasons. This is a big issue. So is the rest of the world going to will Africa be able to negotiate more carbon emissions? And or is there a way through which carbon taxes, we model 4 different types of carbon taxes, if they can fund the African transition? And is there a way that Africa can trade its ability to act as a carbon sink for more emissions? So lots of complicated issues, but I think generally the world is not paying enough attention to the growing energy player demand, carbon emitter, that is Africa long term. It is going to change the world when it comes to energy to an extent that I don't think people realize.
Thanks, Jackie. So I'm going to ask our in-person audience to start thinking about the questions that you want to ask. And I have already received questions from our online discussion, quite a lot of engagement there going on as well. So while you think about that, I've got one question that I'm going to take advantage of. And it's a question around the poverty rates that we've seen in your scenario, Jackie. So in a business as usual scenario, poverty rates we see remain exceptionally high. But even under the most optimistic scenario, and you also mentioned this, Kaliwa, we're not getting rid of poverty. It's as if it's quite sticky. So, I mean, if we had the answer, I wouldn't be asking it, but what can we do? So what are the driving factors behind that? Why are we seeing that? Why are we not getting rid of that? And what should we be looking at? What type of policies should we start looking at to start tackling that? So I'm going to ask both of you to very briefly respond to that.
Kulawa, do you want to go first? Because I've been saying a lot of stuff.
I think for us, when I'll reference the past scenarios that we did, we found that, the biggest challenge is the inequality, and it comes in many different forms. So even if it means access to education or the quality of education, upward mobility, it impacts on all different facets of South African life. And as long as we have not dealt with inequality, we will not deal with anything, including poverty. And also reducing inequality is not something that can be done by government alone. That's when I keep referencing big business, that there is a huge role to play by business, even maybe improving efficiency of government. Jackie has spoken about how inefficient government is. Whereas there's expertise that reside within the private sector. So how do we forge those compacts? If we're going to have meaningful compacts, then these are the areas that we would need to tackle. And but then would need a legitimate government with strong leadership that can compel the private sector to deal with that inequality. And I do believe that if we can just focus on inequality alone, many of these things will fall away. But we can't look to government alone to reduce the inequality of our country, because it's structural, it's historical, and that's why it persists.
Let me add on to that, because it's a nice segue to making a kind of a counterpoint, and that is that only government can, in actual fact, do the transfers and regulate big business and trade to reduce poverty. So you are right. But what we have in South Africa is a particularly capital-intensive economy, partly for a variety of reasons that relate to labor inflexibility and the structure of our economy where we come from. So you have to unlock the opportunity economy, which means you have to provide support and allow it's only small business, micro business, medium business that will actually provide the. So that takes us to the next point, that is to be able to reduce inequality and poverty. You have to grow this economy at double the rates, triple the rates that we are speaking about. I don't know how we do that. We model it and we throw everything at growth, but it's not growing rapidly enough. But the first requirement is you need rapid, inclusive growth. That is employment creation. So we say there is your light manufacturing, there is tourism, there is agriculture, and these kind of sectors that can contribute to this. But that you will, on top of that, have to carry on with social grants and expand them. You will have to have employment schemes and expand them, while you change the way in which our highly concentrated economy operates. It's a complete sea change, I think, of how we operate. And probably the most powerful amongst those is just allowing entrepreneurialism and the informal sector in South Africa to flourish. Because only the informal sector, in actual fact, and we have a very small informal sector in South Africa, can alleviate some of this. But it is probably the most concerning issue in our forecasts.
Yeah. Yes, I did want to ask you, but from a perspective, and you've got 2 minutes, Desigan, because I want the online
Okay.
and the in-person audience to ask questions. The energy transition, is there a possibility within the energy transition to tackle poverty reduction?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Look, all of what both of you said are absolutely true. The inequality issue is massive. And it has to be dealt with. It has to be dealt with much more robustly than we are currently dealing with it. And it needs a policy environment that is more aggressive. But on the issue, let me start at this point. I saw a presentation by Rob Davies, was a former Minister of Trade and Industry, and he did a plot of our economic policy, the main economic policy instruments over time, and then overlaid that on a job creation line. And the only policy that created substantively more jobs than there were before was the RDP. And everything that happened after that point grew an economy very powerfully, because the gear years were high growth years for South Africa, did not create any new employment. It just went down. He needs to publish this so that we can all engage it. It's still reviewed in the paper. So let's go back to exactly that point. What worked in the RDP space? And when we're looking at more broadly climate change, what would work in that space? So one of the most powerful programs that brought people from no work to work almost instantly was working for water. So one of the things that we're engaging now is conceptualizing a working for climate program, because there's a whole bunch of work that we need to do that can be very labor intensive, and it can progress people up the ladder in the same way that working for water did. It provided people employment for 6 months, but it provided training and assistance with various connections so that people actually continue into the world of work, and they have a reasonable record of people budding out their own businesses, for example, micro enterprises, all of them. So in the context of climate change in general, there is huge possibility inside this. Some of the experiments are already starting in the design of what this will mean in a place like Mpumalanga, because if Mpumalanga organizes to have a transition without a fallback, it's going to become a very rapidly, desperately poor province. So the economic beneficiation mechanisms around that, around the new value chains that will support the renewable energy economy or low carbon economy, are already at work, and they work at more sophisticated levels inside that system. The third thing that I think is really critical is that South Africa has not put its hand up to participate in the global value chains around low carbon industrialization. And this is something that we really have to worry about. because South Africa is attractive to the global environment. It serves the purpose of being a different part of the global geography, and this is important for many people. It also has a skills base and an industrial base and an education and training base that is very attractive for people. So absolutely, on the back of the switch to low carbon industrialization in general and low carbon economy, energy in particular, we can be a massive base to grow more jobs, more businesses in this part of the world.
Okay, thank you. So finally, I'm going to open up for questions from the floor. I can see you've been burning for a while to ask questions. I do want to, okay, so it's a second question, and I'm going to take 3 questions and a third question, yeah. So we'll start in that order. You can ask all 3 of them, and then we'll address them to the panelists. Please keep the questions short and state where you are from, the institution.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the insightful presentation and panel discussion. My name is De Villiers. I'm from the Oranje Ontwikkelingsmaatskappy Development Company. Now, our economy is growing rapidly, 10% for the last 3 years, but we are developing an appetite for exports. And since we are in the middle of the country, we need railroads, and we also believe that's the most economical way to go forward. So railways and harbours, what do you think will, under the Government of National Unity and Baba Krisi, do you think there will be a revival for the growth of the economy? Thank you.
A good question. I want to add to that, because there was an online question around that as well, was around the role of infrastructure investment and how do we tackle the issues in our harbours, and how do we get the amount of revitalize rail specifically in the country, and what is the impact of that on South Africa's future? Okay, second question.
Hi, my name is Tara Makoka. I run an organization called Lando Wabantu. And sorry, there's no mic today. I'm not good at speaking now. I have one question for each of the speakers, if that's okay. For Desigan, last week Amitav Ghosh was here. He came in, I'm sure you know him, he was speaking about how do we address the climate crisis. And he was saying that, look, the science argument has pretty much been won. The big issue as to whether we actually fix this is inequality. What are we going to do about that? Because it's those that haven't actually contributed the most to the climate crisis that are obviously experiencing the brunt of the consequences. So I just wanted to know what more needs to be done by South Africa to address the inequality aspect of how we're dealing with climate change. And then for Lewa, did I pronounce that right? I tried. A lot of civil society actors have been very critical of NEDLAC, right? And in the sense that it hasn't really produced the kind of outcomes we want in terms of social compacting. Right. But it seems like in in the way that they went about collecting their data and doing their work, quite successfully in terms of getting to various stakeholders and engaging them. So you spoke about, there having to be spaces for these sorts of conversations, and there isn't enough of them. So from your experience at Indodamiti, what advice would you give to the GNU in terms of better engagement with people? Because you said inclusion as well is a big issue. And then for Dr. Soliers, you see that there were 4 factors that impact on the model: climate change, employment, gender, and Africa in the world. I was wondering if you could comment more on the foreign policy environment that the GNU actually needs to operate in. Because even if we had perfect capacity at government level, those things are still have an impact. Because if you look at the campaigns of the various political parties that are in the GNU leading up to 2024, most of them did not actually focus on foreign policy or an analysis of the global environment. So I just wanted to hear from you, what are the key things that they need to keep in mind, the GNU, in terms of where South Africa is in the world? Thanks.
And then that was one, and the last one.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. My name is Neisha Gomez. I'm a scholar of future studies, a master's in future studies. My question relates to, you made a scenario, a future scenario, So last week, you made a point which I agreed with in your conclusion. You said that as long as we do not have a consensus or a vision for the future, we will not build anything towards the future because we do not have a vision for the future. Now my question becomes, what informs the scenarios if we do not have an ideal state? Because the ideal state, if I do a forecasting, or do a forecasting towards something, if I do a backcasting, or do a backcasting from something. So now we do not have an ideal state. So a person who does the scenarios, for instance, for a tree house, will come with different scenarios, or a person who's doing scenarios for a floating house, or a person who does scenarios for a house on a cave. These are three different houses. Definitely, you're going to demand different methodologies to build these houses. Now, we do not have an end state of a house, what house we're building. So that means then it's difficult to measure the scenarios that are proposing. What is it for? What is the end state of the scenario? The second question is, the last question, you speak of two different paths, which are called the alternatives. The current path, which I'll say the possible features alternative. Then the combined scenarios. But I do not know where to position the combined scenarios. It's easy for me to understand the current path. Because if I apply the pastoral environment, there is this political everybody is in play, this is what we expect to get to 20 to 43. But then what informs the combined scenarios? Combining different elements without explaining the pastel environment, for me, doesn't assess me. What kind of pastel environment do you require for it for that combined scenario to be what it is, to present alternative results, which are much more preferable? Also, lastly, is this combined scenario a probable alternative or a preferable alternative? Thank you.
Okay, Yaki, I'm going to start with you.
Can I go and show something there?
Yes, but you have 2 minutes. But I would like you to please respond first to the question around infrastructure and the role of infrastructure investment, specifically around rail and harbour in South Africa's future.
Thanks, Elise. I want to, because it's been raised a number of times, I just want to go back to that's not okay. To our website. Sorry, I can't see. There's the pop-up is now on my screen. Let me see if I can get rid of it. Okay, so I'm back on the website, and I'm going to go to the themes where. Okay, there we are. Apologies, I can't see on the screen now because the. I'm going to close this. Okay. So this is our theme where we looked at Africa and the world. And basically what we did is we looked at how global developments impact on Africa. So there's a long document that relates to how global developments impact on Africa and its so on and so forth. And including a series of scenarios and how global developments impact on South Africa. On Africa. Those are the 4 global scenarios that we created. And we model each. What is the impact of those different worlds? A sustainable world, a divided world, a world at war, and a growth world on Africa. Now, what we have modeled in actual fact, what I presented to you on South Africa, is part of this world, a sustainable world. It's a world that is pro-growth. A world that there's reform of the international financial institutions and so on and so forth. And that world is quite unlikely. Our current trajectory is somewhere between a fragmented world and a world at war. So those implications spill over across South Africa and everywhere else. So that's just a big caveat.
I think that addresses in terms of where the scenario fits in. Could you maybe address the infrastructure question?
Okay, so we know what the challenges are with regard to infrastructure, and there is significant effort being made through the presidency and elsewhere to deal with the infrastructure backlogs. But it seems to me that only the comprehensive involvement of the private sector, which is where government is going, can really unlock both rail and harbours. And I think relatively rapid change is possible if we see what's happening and how rapidly we eventually manage to turn around with the energy challenge. But having said that, I mean, our biggest short-term challenge is water. It's not electricity or infrastructure. So, anything else? Okay.
I do think the report also clearly states that the investment in infrastructure is critical to unlock the Continental Free Trade Agreement and the value that South Africa can reap from that, as well as to lead this manufacturing export-orientated growth path. Okay, Kalewa, I'm going to, your closing remarks, if you could reflect on the advice to the Government of National Unity, and then maybe to touch on the consensus question that was asked as well. We haven't touched on that.
The consensus question, and I think there was, I think actually they all linked the question around NEDLAC, because that's where all these things come in. And I mean, if the Government of National Unity is looking at creating a weave-a-work nation, there has to be, first and foremost, that coalition government would have to be a listening government. And that is listening to its citizens. Right now, we don't have the culture of politicians that listen to citizens, especially the majority. Again, going back to the demographics, who constitutes the majority? It's young people, they're Black, and also the most vulnerable to be young women, Black and rural areas. Do we have an understanding of what the challenges are within those spaces? Now, when it comes to consensus, I mean, social compacts, which now I think relates to the question. There is this idea that for compacting, you have to have full consensus. But I mean, learning from the CODESA moment, even there was no full consensus. There was sufficient consensus, however. And I think there has to be that understanding that sufficient consensus is actually good to take the country forward and for the greater good, because then you spend all your time negotiating and consulting and trying to please everybody, and which is what we tend to do. Now, that consensus-making platform has been the NEDLAC. And I suppose that's because since our transition into this new dispensation, NEDLAC, through the Act of Law, the NEDLAC Act, was the one that was given this role or function of compacting, you know, first starting with the dialogue and then forging a compact. Like since the days of the RDP, it was actually meant to take forward the work of the RDP, the work of the TRC, and so on, that unfinished project. But what we've found is that NEDLAC has become a bargaining platform that is dominated by business and labor. And even there, it's not, you don't have representation for the informal sector in terms of business, even though we know the potential of the informal sector. You don't have sufficient representation of all labor unions. There's all this gatekeeping. They'll be told that you need to be a federation. So, you know, you have the dominance of COSATU, which is waning really in society, but they still hold power at that NEDLAC platform. When it comes to civil society, there is no, I think first and foremost, in terms of just NEDLAC being fit for purpose, I don't think there's an understanding of what makes civil society. So there is some representation, but to me, it looks like paying lip service to representation for civil society. They've got a community sector there. However, civil society doesn't have a voice when it comes to the NEDLAC. But we can't move away from the fact that NEDLAC is still that official platform. But also another fault with NEDLAC is that in terms of government representation, we believe that the location of NEDLAC with regards to government is not appropriate, because the representation is by labor. And I think that's why you find this shift towards it becoming this bargaining council for labor relations issues, where unions slug it out with business. However, they're forgetting the bigger role that comes to societal issues. So when it comes to that location, what we recommended when we did the research for NEDLAC was to say, perhaps it should be located at the highest office, not at the Department of Labor. Because you can imagine the minister at the Department of Labor who has a seat there is not concerned with all the other areas. And also there's also this disconnect where you find that the Minister of Arts, Sports, Arts and Culture is also given the mandate for social compacting. And there it's about kumbaya, how do we get along and celebrate the Springboks and so on. And that is also regarded as social compacting. However, if you were to elevate the project of compacting to the highest office, then maybe, and also then added to that, find greater and more meaningful representation without all this gatekeeping that exists there. We found that during COVID, Network was quite efficient. We saw an example of good social compacting during COVID. And I think it's because we had this big boogeyman of the pandemic, there was COVID, we didn't understand it, and everyone knew that they were going to die. So maybe that's also another element to our storytelling that we've learned, that you need to actually get people to know that you will die if you do not do these things. Like if inequality persists, the poor will come knocking on our doors and you will die. So during that time, because everybody knew that they were not immune, we found that business could fall in. We found that labor, everyone was collaborating towards a common good. And there, Network was efficient. However, we have not taken lessons from that moment to implement that style of finding consensus, representation, and hearing each other.
So I think that's a good point to tie to the question around inequality. Kesigan, briefly.
Yes, inequality is the big boogeyman, and that's the reality. In fact, Amitav Ghosh's host in South Africa for that visit was Imran Bolodia. And Imran and his unit are currently engaging research on the potential inequality of the transition. Because you can have a much more unequal low carbon world than this terrible inequality that you already have. It's not neutral. It has a vector and it has to be engaged. But a very big part of the current inequality retarding the transition is the direct vested financial interest people have in the current fossil fuel economy. And we're not only talking about big business and their shareholders, we're talking about all those people who have pension funds and unit trusts. And of course, there are none in this room, who are all deeply invested in those oil and gas companies actually being successful so that you're not poor in your retirement. So there is a lock-in in the system that really needs to be shifted. And some big movements have been made, but then also had very difficult threads. One was the Scandinavian insurance funds and pension funds that made a policy declaration on the shift, but haven't actually been able to do it because there are rules in the system that are quite severe. So one of the rules in the system is that you can have a shift in policy if you can guarantee that they won't have any negative financial implications for your members. So you have to guarantee an income from an economy that you still are investing in before you can make that switch, all of which organizes for us to be in a stratified system. So what would break that? And the thing that would break that is radical policy decisions to make those shifts. If we don't manage to do it, if we simply rely on diffusion and osmosis, it's not going to happen.
Okay, so I think it brings us to the end, but I do see Muletsi Mbeki, you've got your hand up on the online platform. If you want to quickly take the stage to either ask your question or make your comment, that will be the final one for this session.
Thank you, Madam. I've had a good listen to the scenarios, but I think we have a scenario missing, which is the political scenario. Governance is not the same thing as politics. Governance is the management of the state. Politics is the ownership of the state. Today in South Africa, we have rule by the ANC and the DA, and I agree with Helen Ziller there that that's really what we have. But what is ruled by the ANC and the DA is ruled by the English-speaking Christian middle classes of South Africa. That's really what rule by the ANC and the DA adds up to. So I disagree with Yaki observation that the two political parties come from very diverse backgrounds. They don't. They come from the same background. They are English-speaking parties. They come from the middle class. They are aspire to an Anglo-Saxon political culture. Mandela has articulated this very well. But there are other social groups in South Africa. So we are having today in our politics political rule by the middle class, the black, the African, and the English-speaking middle classes of all races. But we have other classes in South Africa. What about the capitalist class? What about the working class? What about the poor? And so on and so forth. So I think there is another scenario that Yaki has to start working on. That is my suggestion, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexia, and I think a good point taken. Can I conclude? Do you want to?
Just can I make two brief points?
You can make one brief point.
Well, it is right in terms of the absence of the political scenarios, because we haven't tried to do that. Second point I wanted to make was that I didn't answer on the foreign policy issue, really. But if you read that theme that I went to, we essentially make the point that South Africa and much of Africa just wants to stay out of the global divides and look after our interests and not be instrumentalized either on Ukraine, Taiwan, or any of this. Our interests are developmental interests.
So I also think making the point very strongly about representation, and that is quite important. Okay, so I'm going to ask you and invite you to give a round of applause to our panelists. That I'm going to conclude our online audience and say thank you for joining us online. We appreciate your inputs, your questions. And for those in person, I'm going to invite you to further the conversation as we network for the next half an hour or so outside. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.